Greetings and welcome back to 303. We are in Senior English A, and we now turn to arguably the greatest of the writers of the English post-Renaissance period, late Renaissance period, John Milton. In fact, often when you are asked, who's the greatest English writers of all time, certainly Shakespeare's always right there at number one, with John Milton usually right there at number two. I'm with you in your hymnals on page 516, 517 and following. We want to read some information first on Milton, just to make sure that we're on board with this guy. Literary History, Milton's World. I hope you're with me on page 516, and we'll just read. You just read along with me. We're going to bullet point at level 1. That's all we're doing. Let's take a few notes. In the 1650s, the aged John Milton decided to retell the biblical story of the creation, fall, and redemption of humanity in two epics, Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained. I hope you have both of those titles written down, Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained. With these works, Milton reaffirmed Britain's core values after a decade of war. Let's take a look at the first heading, Making Darkness Visible, Milton's epic ambition. Milton had compelling reasons for telling the story. By 1652, he was completely blind. I would write that down. By 1652, he's lost his sight. Unable to write, he dictated the poem to his daughters, who copied down each word. As he worked, the world crumbled around him. The monarchy he had opposed was restored to England, and he went to jail for a time. Blind, disgraced, and disillusioned, Milton nevertheless persevered. Over perhaps 10 years, he dictated nearly 11,000 lines of poetry. The result, critics agree, is the greatest epic in the English language, Paradise Lost. So in other words, we are going to argue Milton is quite remarkable because he writes a poem of 11,000 lines completely blind. He recites these lines. He can't write them because he's blind. Let's take a look at overview. Like many epic poems, Paradise Lost begins in the middle, in medias res. Milton introduces Satan, who along with his angel allies has done the unthinkable, rebelled against God. Expelled from heaven, they have plummeted into hell, a place devoid of light, life, and even form. One great furnace flamed is the quote from Milton, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discern sights of woe, end quote. Satan's war with heaven is Milton's invention. The remainder of the story is the familiar one of Christian tradition. God has forbidden Adam and Eve to eat fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Bent on revenge, Satan tempts Eve into eating the apple. She then persuades Adam to partake. This event, the fall of Adam and Eve, leads to their, and so humanity's, expulsion from the Garden of Eden. They leave paradise with a sense of hope, and again Milton, quote, the world was all before them where to choose their place of rest, and providence their guide, end quote. The next heading, a cosmic commentary. Apart from telling this grand story, large portions of Paradise Lost are dedicated to another grand project, quote, to justify the ways of God to men, end quote. What we'll call later theodicy, Theodicy. In the story, God sends the angel Raphael to paradise to warn Adam of the necessity of obedience. In their conversation, Milton is able to speak on a few issues that were controversial in his day. These two are especially bullet pointed. Let's get them in our notes. First, reason and free will. Humanity can see the difference between right and wrong. With that ability comes the freedom to choose between the two. Free will and predestination. God knows everything that is, was, and will be, omnipotent. Yet God's foreknowledge does not mean that people's choices are determined in advance by God. People have free will. Obviously, a difficult or a thorny question, right? I'm at the top of page 517. By affirming free will, Milton broke with some of the sternest Puritans of his day who held that men and women are predestined to salvation or damnation. Milton's epic story finds individuals responsible for their own actions and fate, and so grants them dignity. Notice the next heading, Whirls in the Void. In a sense, Paradise Lost is Milton's answer to the great historical crisis through which Britain had passed. Puritans, including Milton, had challenged the official Church of England. They demanded a return to what they saw as the original principles of the Christian religion. At the same time, religious controversy led to the Civil War of 1642 to 1649, in which Parliament eventually put its own king, Charles I, to death. These upheavals shattered the symbolic centers of English life and culture, church and king. With Paradise Lost, Milton helped the nation find its bearings again by retelling the central story of its culture. In the figure of Satan, he commemorated the destructive forces that had recently torn through the nation. At the same time, the fall of Satan symbolically puts rebellious urges into their proper place, the netherworld of hell. It was these tasks, perhaps, that drove the blind Milton to rise above adversity and deliver this epic to his country. Finally, Milton's legacy on page 517. Over the centuries, Milton's story of the fall has become as well known as the biblical version. It's influenced writers as diverse as the poets William Blake, the visionary, and John Keats, the introspective dreamer, as well as the novelist George Eliot, a formidable social critic. By the 19th century, study of Milton's epic was considered an essential part of a respectable education, and even relatively uneducated people could be expected to have 2 books in their homes, the King James Bible and Paradise Lost. In telling a story to heal his own time, Milton fed the imaginations of generations to come. Let's go ahead and turn now to introduce ourselves to John Milton on page 518. It says something, doesn't it, that notice, very few of the authors that we've studied in our anthology get 2 full pages of biographic information, which tells you right away, obviously, to scope the significance of this writer. First of all, dates. Let's write them down. 1608 to 1674. If we use 1600 as the date for when Shakespeare's Hamlet is performed for the first time on stage, you can see that then. Milton is born 8 years after the performance of Shakespeare's Hamlet, right? Let's read together now, starting on 518. John Milton is regarded as one of the greatest poets of the English language, yet he owes this regard to comparatively few poems. Much of his work is in Latin, not English, and during the 15 years he spent writing political pamphlets and other prose work, he wrote little poetry. Although other poets have surpassed him in quantity, Milton's masterpiece, the epic Paradise Lost, is enough to establish him as the equal of Chaucer and Shakespeare. And so there it is. That's sometimes referred to as the Holy Trinity of English writers. Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, right? Milton himself never lacked self-confidence, setting his sights on poetic greatness at the start of his career. Let's go ahead and read now under these different headings. A privileged childhood. Milton was born in London to a middle-class family and grew up in a highly cultured environment. His father, a professional scribe who drew up contracts and lent money, was also a composer and musician of considerable ability. Deeply religious, Milton's father was devoted to the Protestant cause. At the age of 13, Milton started his formal education, the equivalent of high school. He was also tutored at home. He mastered Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, as well as several modern European languages. After this thorough education, Milton went to college. Let's just say it out loud. He is definitely one of our great examples of a polymath, along with somebody like Francis Bacon. His genius shows early. As I will say in another lecture, Milton not only was blessed with the capacity to read in multiple languages, he had a prodigious memory. He could remember stuff that he had read from way back when, and it obviously came into great use once he lost his sight and was blind, and still had to put together the greatest English epic poem of all time, Paradise Lost. Let's keep going on 519. God's poet. When Milton entered Christ's College at Cambridge University, he had already decided to prepare himself for a career as a great poet. God's poet was how he described himself. It appears that for a time he also considered entering the ministry. The religious and political situation at the time, though, was quite uncertain. So, Milton devoted himself to a life of study. After earning his degrees from Cambridge, he withdrew to his father's house, first at Hammersmith, then at Horton in Buckinghamshire, for nearly 6 years, where it is said he read everything that was written in the ancient and modern languages at his command. It was during this long period of study that he wrote one of his most best-known poems, Lycidias. That work, together with the poems Allegro as well as El Personito, written during his student days, marked the young Milton as a gifted poet destined for fame. The next heading, a man of ideals. Following his studies, Milton went to continental Europe for a planned 2-year grand tour during which he called on the astronomer Galileo. While he was away, Parliament rebelled against King Charles I, eventually replacing the monarchy with a government led by Oliver Cromwell. Learning of the revolt, Milton cut short his trip and returned to England. He began writing pamphlets for the Puritan cause, criticizing the control of the bishops over the English church. Public service, private loss, the next heading. In 1649, when the Puritans decided to execute Charles I, Milton wrote a treatise defending this act. Impressed by Milton's brilliantly presented opinions, Cromwell made him Secretary of State for Foreign Tongues. This position required Milton to translate official documents into Latin and to write in defense of the new government against royalist attacks. It was while serving in this position that he lost his eyesight. In 1660, let's write that date down, 1660, Milton's fortunes took a turn for the worse. The monarchy was restored, and Milton was imprisoned for a time. His friend, the poet Andrew Marvell, the poet that we read before, To His Coy Mistress, may have been instrumental in gaining his release. Blind and stripped of most of his property, Milton withdrew once again into words. He wrote Paradise Lost. Let's write the date, 1667. 1667, the greatest epic of the English language. Okay. Now on page 520, they're going to try and show you how Milton has had some influence on pop culture. Let's take a look at this. Some of you will be very fascinated with this observation. In Milton, I'm reading on page 520, Dark Heroes in that box. In Milton's 17th century epic poem, Paradise Lost, God cast Satan out of heaven and into hell. The fallen angel is vivid and dark at the same time. In this respect, Satan is like other larger-than-life figures who, though villainous, rivet our attention. While none are more powerful than the devil, there are many dark hero figures in popular culture. Look at this list, right, that will make some sense, I think, for a number of you. Darth Vader. Many have asked, where did such a character like Darth Vader in the Star Wars movies come from? Unforgettable villain, obviously, of Star Wars movies. Brutal enforcer of empire rule, Vader was instantly memorable for the helmet that covered his face and, of course, the James Earl Jones voice, right? How about Magento? Some of you love this character. Another enemy of true heroes was introduced in the first issue, 1963, of X-Men, the comic written by Stan Lee, illustrated by Jack Kirby. Like Satan, and of course later turned into movies, right? Like Satan, he's the head of an army, not the Dark Angels of Hell, but of course the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Finally, the physically deformed musical genius Eric, better known as the Phantom in Phantom of the Opera, right? LaRue's great novel, The Phantom of the Opera, of course, in 1910. Of course, we have the amazing opera now as well that was a Hollywood Broadway show for so many years, right? This idea then is, in Milton's Paradise Lost, we will have a very interesting anti-hero, Satan. And as we now get ready to pick up our study of Paradise Lost, we're going to take a look at how that hero is constructed and maybe ask some things about the psychological deportment of that hero. Let's now take a look at 521 real quickly in closing, to just pay attention to a couple of the ideas before we get ready to study. Read with me on 521, connecting to the essential question. John Milton brings to life a well-known story of the time about angels who rebelled against God. As you read, notice vivid passages in Milton's description of the underworld in Paradise Lost. Seeing such descriptions in your mind's eye will help you answer the essential question, what is the relationship of writer to tradition? Under literary analysis at 2B, let's get ready to write down a few pieces of information. An Italian or Petrarchian sonnet is a 14-line poem, lyric poem, with a distinctive structure. Notice the first 8 lines called the octave will rhyme A, B, B, A, B, B, A, and present a problem. A 6-line sextet with a variable rhyme scheme responds to the octave. In Milton's Italian sonnets, the structure of the octave and the sextet contributes to the structure, meaning, aesthetic pleasure of the entire sonnet. We're going to look at a couple of sonnets by Milton here in a second. An epic, we definitely want to write this word down. An epic is a long narrative poem about a hero. For 17th century English writers, ancient epic poets such as Homer, the blind, half-mythically author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, set the standard for literary greatness. Milton uses the following features of Homeric epics in his Paradise Lost. Let's look at them. There are 3. You want to write them down. First of all, the first bullet point. A story that begins in the middle of the action, often what we'll refer to as in medias res. You want to write that Latin term down. An opening invocation in which the poet calls for divine aid in telling his story, what we will call the invocation of the muse. And finally, extended similes, comparisons using like or as. Look for these epic elements as you read Paradise Lost, and analyze how in the sonnets the structure of the parts contributes to the structure and meaning of the poem, the whole. Under reading strategy, if you do not understand a passage, repair your comprehension by using a graphic organizer like the one to the right. This organizer can help you break down long, confusing sentences into smaller parts, main clauses, which can stand by themselves, and supporting clauses which cannot. So it makes a whole lot of sense to kind of work with a graphic organizer like this. Finally, I would definitely make sure that you know these vocab words that are here at the bottom of the page on 521. You will definitely see these words on the examination that will come. And of course, it will help you to be able to do the reading then of the 3 Milton passages to follow. We're going to look at 3 Milton passages. We're going to look at, if you'll turn your page real quickly to 522, we're going to look at Sonnet 7, we're going to look at Sonnet 19, and then finally we're going to turn to the greatest of English epic poems, Paradise Lost. Thank you.